Now that all the parts of your blanket have been joined, we can now move on to the border, which consists of 6 rounds, just using the Mocha and the Storm Blue yarn. So we're going to start by joining to any corner stitch with a standing DC, the corner space here. So standing DC, and we're going to work another 2 DC into that same corner space. Then we're going to work a DC into every stitch all the way across. So I'll work a DC into every stitch across this square, and then I'll show you what happens when we get to where the squares join here. So now I've got up to where the corners of these 2 squares meet. We're working into the chain 2 space, so that's this one here and this one here. So we're going to work a DC into that corner space. Then we're going to put our hook into that space again, grab the yarn and pull through. Then we're going to go into the next chain 2 space, grab the yarn and pull through. So you've got 3 loops on the hook and pull them together. So you DC 2 tog over the 2 chain spaces. That brings them together. And then we're going to work another DC into that space. So it's 1 DC, DC 2 tog over the 2 spaces and 1 DC. So that's what you're going to do where your corners, every time you've got 2 squares that meet. There should be the 2 chain space on either side. And then you're just going to carry on working DCs all the way around. When you get to the corner, like we did here, 3 DC into that corner. And that should neaten up your edge nicely for doing the rest of the border. Make sure that you've got 209 DCs on each side of the blanket. And then plus your very centre DC from the 3. So excluding your very centre DC, you should have 209 along each side. Okay, so if you complete that, and I'll see you for the second round. So I've just got to the end of round 1. So now I'm going to join with a slip stitch to the standing DC. And I'm going to chain 1 and DC into that same space. Then I'm going to work 3 DC into that corner DC. Then I'm going to DC into the next stitch and chain 3. And then DC into the next 2 stitches. Then I'm going to miss 2 stitches and work a fan stitch, which is a treble, a chain. So repeat that another 2 times. Treble, chain, treble, chain, and then 1 last treble into that same space. So that's your fan. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 trebles with a chain in between each one. Then we're going to miss 2 stitches and work a DC into each of the next 2. Chain 3 and work a DC into each of the next 2 stitches. So then we work our fan stitch again. So miss 2 stitches, treble into the next stitch, chain 1, repeat that another 2 times, treble, chain, treble, chain, and one last treble. So that makes your fan stitch. Miss 2 stitches and DC into the next 2, chain 3, and DC into the next 2. So that's the pattern that you're repeating, your shell and your chain 3. So you're just repeating that all the way around. When you get to the corner, you should finish on a chain 2, DC into your next 2, chain 3, DC, and then you can work your 3 DC into the corner, then 1 DC and chain 3, and then your pattern repeat continues then. Okay, so if you work that all the way around, and I'll see you here for round 3. So now that I've got to the end of round 2, I'm going to be finishing on a chain 3, and I'll be slip stitching to the first DC of where I started. So slip stitched there. Now I'm going to slip stitch into the next DC. So that's 2 slip stitches there. Then I'm going to 3 DC into the next DC, which will be my corner stitch. So I've got 3 DCs into there. So now I'm going to miss the next 2 stitches, missing that one and missing that one. So I'm working into the chain 3 space, and I'm going to work a shell, the same as what we've done here. So that's a treble, chain, treble, chain, treble, chain, and one last treble. So that should be 4 trebles, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm chaining 2. And then you're missing the next 5 stitches. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you're working a DC, chain 3, and a DC into that centre chain 1 space of your shell. So you've worked into your chain 3 space, putting a shell in there. Then you're working into the centre of your next shell, working a DC, chain 3 and a DC. So now we're going to chain 2 again. And we're going to work a shell into the next chain 3. There we go. So then chain 2, and we're working, skipping all these stitches, working into that centre chain 1 in the middle of your shell, working a DC, 3 chain and a DC. So then chain 2, skip these stitches, and you're working into the next chain 3 space, you're working your shell. So it's quite a simple pattern that you're repeating. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So then you'll be chaining 2 and working a DC, 3 chain and a DC into the centre of your next, to that centre chain 1 of your next shell. So if you just repeat that all the way around, and you get to your corner, you want to be doing as you've done here, working 3 DC. 3 DC into your corner, and then continue on with a shell. So you'll 3DC, skip next 2 stitches, then work a shell, and then your pattern will repeat exactly the same. Okay, so if you do that all the way around, and then I'll see you to finish it off. So now I've got to the end of round 3. So I've ended with a shell stitch and chain 2. And then I'm going to slip stitch to the first DC. And then I'm going to slip stitch into the second DC, which is the corner DC. And then I'm going to chain 4, which counts as a treble and a chain. So then I'm going to work a treble into that same DC, a chain, a treble, a chain, and a treble to make a shell. Then I'm going to chain 2, and then skipping these stitches, working into that center chain of the next shell and working a DC, chain 3 and a DC, chain 2, and then I'm working a shell into the next chain 3. So I'm missing these stitches, working a shell into here. So a treble, a chain, treble, chain, and a treble, chain, and one last treble. So you've got your 4 trebles in there. Chain 2, and then missing these stitches, working into that next, into your center shell, that center chain 1 space of your next shell. We're working a DC, chain 3 and a DC. So you get the idea now, because it's the same pattern as what we were working last time on the row before, but the opposite way around. So here we were putting the chain 3 and your DCs into that center shell there, so it's just moved over one. So your shells are going into your chain 3 and your chain 3 is going into the center of your shell. So just work that all the way around. And in the center stitch for your corner, you're working a shell, so your pattern just keeps repeating round. Alright, so I'll see you here for finishing it off. So now that we've got to the end of round 4, we're finishing with the chain 3 and a DC into that center shell and a chain 2, and we're going to join that with a slip stitch. That first 4 chain that we did, we're joining it to the third one. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're joining it to there with a slip stitch. So that finishes off that round and makes it symmetrical. So now we're going to slip stitch to the first chain 1 space, like so. And now we're going to chain 4. That counts as a DC and 3 chains. Now we're going to DC into that same space. Then we're going to work a DC, chain 3 and a DC into the next chain 1 space. So DC, chain 3, DC. And then we're going to do that again into the next. So into the next chain 1 space. So as you can see, that shell that first shell consists of 1, 2, 3 chain 1 spaces, and we're working a DC, chain 3 and a DC into each one of them. So it makes these 3 little points there. Okay. So now we're going to chain 2, and we're going to work a shell into the next chain 3. And then the pattern starts all over again how it has been doing. Working a shell into the chain 3 and working a chain 3 into the centre shell, chaining 2 in between each time. So missing all this, going into that centre chain of the shell and working a DC, chain 3 and a DC. And then when you get to the corner, you'll finish on a DC, on a shell, you'll chain 2, and then you'll work a DC, a chain 3 and a DC into each of the chain 1 spaces of that shell that sits on your corner. So you're just repeating this on every corner, and then when you've done that, your pattern repeats again, working a shell into the chain 3 into a shell. Okay? So if you do that all the way around, and then we'll finish it off when we get to here. So now you've got to the end of round 5, you should have finished with a shell and 2 chain, and we're joining with an invisible join to that very first chain that we did of the 4 chain. So just slip that in there, put it through to the front, and just the back loop of the last stitch that we did and put it through to the back. There we go. So now we can grab our storm blue yarn for the final round, round 6. So we're going to start with a standing DC to any of the centre chain 3s of any corner. So this is our centre chain 3 of the corner. So now we're going to chain 3 and work another DC into that same chain 3 space. And we're going to chain 1 and work a DC, chain 3, DC into the next chain 3 space. There we go. Then we're going to work a DC into the 2 DCs into the next chain 2 space, so that's just before the shell. Then we're going to miss that treble and work a DC into that chain 1 space. Work a DC into that treble. Work a DC into that next chain 1 space, which should be the centre of that shell, and into the next treble and into the next chain 1 space. So you're working into every stitch of the shell apart from the first and last treble. Then we're going to work a DC, 2 DCs into that next chain 2 space between the shell you've just worked and the next chain 3 space. So now we've got to our next chain 3 space, we're going to work a DC, chain 3 and a DC into there. And then 2 DC into the next chain 2 space in between your chain 3 and your shell. And we're missing that first treble, working a DC into the next chain 1 space, DC into the next treble, DC into the next chain 1 space, DC into the next treble, and DC into the next chain 1 space. And then 2 DCs into the next chain 2 space in between the shell you've just worked and the chain 3. Then we're working a DC, chain 3, and a DC into that next chain 3 space. So you can see the pattern now. That's what your final edging should look like. So working then 5 stitches over your shell, 2 stitches into every chain 2 space, and a DC, chain 3 and a DC into every chain 3 space. And then when you get to the corner, you're working a DC, a chain 3 and a DC with 1 chain in between for each of them the 3 chain 3 loops in the corner. Okay, so when we get back round, we still have 1 to do here. So we'll be finishing, I'll show you anyway, but we'll be finishing with a DC, a chain 3 and a DC to finish that corner. Okay, so if you work all the way around, and then we will be finished. So now we've got to the end of round 6. You should have finished working over a shell and then your last 2 DC into that last chain 2 space. So finish before that first chain 3 that we did to complete our corner. So we're going to work a DC into that chain 3 space, chain 3 and a DC, and then we're going to join with an invisible join to the beginning, which will be that first DC. There we go, so that's completed them 3 little pickups with the chain 3 that we've got there. So that is it finished. So we just have those few ends to sew in, and then we can take a look at the full blanket. So this is what the finished blanket should look like. I hope you've enjoyed making it as much as I have. And we just want to say a big thank you to Bligh for a fabulous design and Pippin Crochet Club for hosting the KAL on their Facebook page. We hope to see you again soon, and thanks for taking part.